Hello everyone, welcome. I'm Jeevan Vasiga, climate editor at Tortoise. Thank you all very much for joining us. I have to say it's an immense privilege to be a climate journalist at the moment. It feels to me a bit like I'm in mid-19th century Britain hanging around watching the Industrial Revolution take place. It really feels to me as if this is the moment, this last year I think, is the moment when climate seems to have shifted from being something that's seen as a challenge to something that's seen as an opportunity. And I think that's particularly true at the political level. So we've seen a clean $1 trillion being created for green investment in the US, carbon border tariff in the EU. I think it's a bit more uneven at business level, and that's going to be the focus of what we're going to talk about today. I think in some sectors you've really seen transformation. So you've seen in solar energy, for example, we've got the incentives right, we've got the sequencing right, we've got the scale right, and there's been a massive, massive shift towards solar. I think there are other areas where we're beginning to see change, and there are some areas like food in which we haven't begun to have that conversation. I want to think today about how we shift the conversation in businesses, the kind of conversations that we need to have within supply chains and with customers. I'd like to begin by talking to you, Jenny, about how things have changed. So, Jenny, you work with Landsec. First of all, tell us who Landsec is, what you do, and then let's begin to think about how you intersect with net zero.
Cool, so thanks so much, Jeevan. Thanks for having me. I'm Jenny. I head up sustainability at Landsec. So for those of you who don't know who Landsec are, we are a UK real estate company with a £10.2 billion portfolio of assets, predominantly London assets. So hopefully some of you are occupying some of our offices. They're really energy efficient and low embodied carbon. So we're predominantly London offices. We also own some retail centres across the UK, like Bluewater in Kent or St David's down in Cardiff. And we've also got a growing pipeline of mixed-use urban schemes, so a mix of resi, retail and office. For Landsec, sustainability has long been a strategic priority for us, and that's demonstrated by the fact that back in 2016, we were the first real estate company in the world to have our carbon reduction target approved by the SBTi. And if you haven't heard of the SBTi or Science Based Target Initiative, I'd urge you to go and look at it, because it's fast becoming the most credible methodology in setting.
I think we're all nerds in this room, Jenny. We're fine on that. Yeah.
Perfect. So we have got a near-term target to reduce emissions by 47% by 2030 from a 1920 baseline, and to meet net zero by 2040. I think just to set the scene in the built environment, and I will answer your question, Jeevan, eventually about what are the opportunities for us. But within the built environment, the majority of our carbon emissions are coming from the emissions from operating our buildings, and then the dreaded emissions the dreaded embodied carbon emissions, which are the emissions from our construction activities when we design and develop new schemes. And that's really challenging to reduce those embodied carbon emissions. For a real estate company, the opportunities for us with decarbonisation, or our drivers for decarbonisation, are threefold. It's firstly around the regulation. And as you will know, there's a plethora of environmental legislation that we all need to meet, from the planning side around reducing embodied carbon, but then also from the operational side. And the key performance, or the key regulation that's driving us as an organisation, is the minimum energy efficiency standard, which at the moment government is consulting to ensure that it's EPC-B by 2030. So we need to ensure that our assets are performing against that EPC-B by 2030. The other driver for us for decarbonisation is around market demand. So as more of us, as you say, we're all nerds in the room and know about SBTi, but as more of us set carbon reduction targets, our occupiers are demanding that the spaces they're occupying are meeting the highest environmental and well-being standards. In fact, we did a survey a while ago with our office occupiers, and 68% of them are saying that, yes, they want to occupy space in the right location with the right accessibility. They want to occupy prime grade A office space, but they want to also ensure that they're occupying space that's energy efficient, keeping their operational costs down. And for us, that's a real opportunity, because we see, or research has shown, that those buildings with good environmental credentials against BREEAM or WELL standards, they are tending to attract higher rents and tending to attract higher valuations. So if we are building net zero carbon buildings, both in construction and operation, we hope to reap the benefits of those higher rents, retaining occupiers, and those higher valuations.
Jenny, we saw HSBC announcing yesterday a move from Canary Wharf back to the city, basically. So how's that, and a reduction in floor space as a result, and they talked about that as sort of helping them meet their net zero commitment. How is that trend to hybrid working intersecting with net zero?
So I think lots of offices and even retailers are looking at their property portfolio and looking to downsize or optimize their property portfolio. And that, as a real estate company, we need to be aware of that. And that's why we need to ensure that we are creating, designing and developing schemes that meet these occupiers' needs. And that is about those high environmental and wellbeing standards. I think that what we've seen is obviously during COVID, our carbon footprint emissions and all of yours will have reduced significantly. We're not having to turn on the buildings, they're not being occupied as much. But what I think we've found with occupancy is that Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday are now the busy days, Monday and Friday are the less busy days. So it's how can we start to behave differently within our offices, looking at zonal working, where if you've only got a few people coming into your office space on a Monday or Friday, can you look to just work in a certain area of the office and therefore you can turn off the heating and ventilation for the other area and the lighting, saving emissions. So I think we need to work differently, but I would stress that we believe and, well, we know that there is still always going to be a space for physical workplace. We know that coming into the office is great for collaboration, those water cooler moments. So I think the office is here to stay, but how we use the office needs to change and evolve.
Okay, we're going to try and prove that this morning. Sarah, I want to get a bit more into the sort of conversation that you need to have in your supply chain. But first, let's hear from you, Sarah, and tell us first a bit about Haleon, the company that, as I said this morning, is ubiquitous, but no one's ever heard of. So, yeah, tell us who you are.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you all. I'm Sarah McDonald, heading up sustainability for Haleon. And Haleon was formerly the consumer healthcare division of GSK. And we spun off as a separately listed company in July last year. So we're coming up for our first birthday as a standalone company, and we make products that some of you may have used today when you came here. So Sensodyne toothpaste or Aquafresh, Corestill mouthwash, Panadol. Hopefully no one's got a headache. Maybe Pirates if you're a hay fever sufferer. So, or maybe you had a Centrum vitamin to boost your wellness, but that's the area we work in. So all over the counter, everyday healthcare products.
And just thinking about that framing that I gave at the start of climate as an opportunity, how do you think this is an opportunity for a business like yours?
Well, as a healthcare company whose purpose is to deliver better everyday health with humanity, we're looking at everything through the lens of health and how can we support people's everyday health. And climate change is the single biggest threat to human health, as the WHO has cited. And so it's very close to us, really. And what we see is it's not just the kind of extreme weather events that are impacting people's health. It's everyday things. So 93% of people in the world are breathing air that exceeds WHO's safe limits for pollution, and that's really affecting people's respiratory health, which is one of the categories we operate in. And so there's lots of things we need to do to play a serious part in reducing our own climate footprint, which is pretty small as a healthcare company, but also in helping people understand the impact of climate change on their health and helping mitigate that. So maybe just one easy example of that is sticking with that example of air pollution. Is one of our brands, Otrivin, has launched a product called Breathe Clean. It's a way of washing your nose, so your nose is your own kind of personal ventilation system that helps filter out pollution. And if you wash your nose, then you help avoid pollution going into your respiratory system. And the brand is also doing work in schools to educate young people and their families and teachers around simple actions you can take every day to mitigate or reduce your exposure to air pollution. So doing things like walking to school, not driving to school, but taking the road one back from the busy road, because pollution's very immediately focused, particularly when you've got, diesel car emissions. So getting kids to wear little pollution sensors and practice how they could walk to school differently, basically, and reduce their exposure. And interestingly, that sensitization to people of things like diesel emissions, carbon emissions are not just a big problem out there in the world, it's a problem right here, right now for me, in my world, in my individual health. It's also a really useful trigger to get people to think about their own behaviour. And so whereas you might bang on to someone about, oh, don't drive to school, it's bad for the climate or whatever, if you say, don't drive to school, it's bad for your kids' health, and get people engaged in that, it's actually a really compelling motivator for people to make a change.
I'm really glad that's where the illustration ended up, because I was a bit worried you were about to say, we're going to get kids to take the back routes, so it's safe for the diesel cars to drive down the main road. That's our objective here.
No, it's like an interesting nudge to get people to say, well, maybe I won't drive to school anymore, you know,
Sarah, you talked about your company's own carbon footprint being quite low, but obviously, I mean, it's often the case, if you look at it in the round, that most of the emissions are elsewhere. Most of the emissions are in the value chain. So, you know, where are the Scope 3 emissions for your company?
Yeah, so the biggest source of emissions for us is upstream in the carbon, a bit like yourself, in the embedded carbon that is in the raw packaging materials that we buy and also services. So more than 50% of our Scope 3 emissions sit upstream in those purchased items, so ingredients mainly and packaging raw materials. So for us, we've set a goal to reduce our Scope 3 emissions source to sale by 42% by 2030 and to get to net zero by 2040. And we really need to go after those ingredients. And unfortunately, the title of this is kind of very apt for us, because there's not one or two ingredients or pack materials that drive it. It really is a case of everything everywhere all at once, where we have a number of packaging materials that drive the footprint, but also raw ingredients, whether that's sorbitol, mint, etc. So we need to re-engineer. We need to start by optimizing. So we're doing a lot of work engaging with our suppliers to get them to take actions like we've taken to move to 100% renewable electricity. Because for some ingredients, the big part of the carbon emissions sits in its production. For others, though, it's embedded. I
want to get into the...
go for it.
I want to get into the how, which is in the title. But before we do that, just give us an example, Sarah, of what you're talking about in terms of the ingredients. So what are the... There are presumably some ingredients in some of the products you make that are really just very hard to substitute. You can swap out plastic for paper, but I guess there are things in toothpaste that that are very, very difficult to substitute. Yeah,
so the active ingredients that deliver the core benefit of the product, whether that's fluoride in toothpaste or paracetamol in a Panadol tablet, are very difficult to substitute for something else, because it's that active ingredient that delivers the clinical benefit. And so there, it's really a question of understanding where do those emissions come from. And what we see is for some of the ingredients, it's a mix of there's high emissions in production, so that we can go after by encouraging suppliers to move to renewable electricity, renewable energy, which is something that can move more quickly. But often it's 50% of that and 50% of what it's derived from. And so there we really need to go after, can you, for example, sorbitol in toothpaste. So if you didn't have it in toothpaste, you wouldn't get it out the tube. That comes from corn and wheat. How can you produce corn and wheat differently to make it less carbon intensive? Or could you make sorbitol from something else, from an ancient grain or something else that's inherently less carbon intensive? So lots of work to do to look at the kind of quicker win. How do we bring the emissions from production down? But then the long, what's going to take more fundamental work is how do you derive those ingredients from something else that is low or no carbon? Yeah, and just, Sarah, just one more point to you before I come back to Jenny. When you're having those conversations with suppliers, what do you find in terms of their attitude? Do they have do they feel that they're sort of in this with you? This is a sort of shared journey. They're open to having these conversations. How do you do that? It's a real spectrum, to be honest. And we've done a mapping of our suppliers, to look at ones that are kind of leaders. So they're really on top of it. They've done lots of, they've got their own carbon commitments. They've done lots of work to understand their own footprint. And then we have more nascent, I would say, suppliers who are really just starting to engage with this now. And so we need to bring everybody on a journey of, first, if you're in that camp, the first thing you need to do is understand where your emissions come from. So we're encouraging all our suppliers to get on to Manufacture 2030 as a shared platform to map their carbon emissions so they understand what drives them first, and then put an action plan in place to move. But I think I think what's great is everyone, wherever they sit, understand the need for action, particularly when we make the case connecting the impact of climate change to health, and we're a healthcare company, they get it. It's just some of them have further to travel than others. Jenny, I'd like to put the same point to you and then come to Rob. But I'd also love to hear from the room. Presumably people in the room are having similar conversations in their value chain. So do just grab my eye, wave your hand at me, but come into this conversation. But Jenny, so when you're hearing kind of Sarah talking about kind of having that supply chain conversation, does that ring bells with you? Is it a very similar kind of...
Yeah, it resonated with me when Sarah was talking about alternatives. So in the construction world, the biggest high carbon intensive industries is steel and concrete.
Yeah.
And interestingly, with the decarbonisation of concrete or looking for alternatives for cement that are less carbon intensive, at the moment there's a product called GGBS, which is a byproduct of the steel manufacturing process. And GGBS has far lower embodied carbon than Portland cement. But the issue with GGBS is that it's a byproduct of steel manufacturing. So as steel decarbonises, you're going to have less GGBS in the supply chain, and therefore we need other alternatives to cement than GGBS. So for us, it's really around collaboration and partnership and working with steel and concrete manufacturers. So joining up with other developers, with other construction activities. There's two really good initiatives called Steel Zero and Concrete Zero. And it's about joining up with the industry to push that demand for low carbon steel and low carbon concrete. Okay. So it really resonated with me around the alternatives.
How do you make net zero kind of the default in these sort of supply chain conversations? Are there sort of mechanisms that you can use to sort of push change? I mean, is there a way of writing it into purchase agreements, writing it into contracts? Like, how does that? What's the thinking around that?
So we've totally changed the way, and most developers are doing this, totally changed the way we're working with our supply chain and our contractors and bringing them on really early doors within the design process, even within the feasibility stage, because often that innovation and that thought leadership is happening within our tier 3, tier 4 suppliers. They're the ones that are seeing these new low carbon alternatives, new low carbon materials. So for us, when we're looking at a new scheme and designing and developing, the first thing is we ensure that we bring carbon consultants on early doors to ensure that every design decision, we are considering the whole life carbon of that development. And then it's bringing on our supply chain, our contractors, and their subcontractors on really early doors within that design development, because that's where the innovation is happening.
Okay.
And it's being brave enough to trial these new things. I think often some of these products take ages to get through the right certifications and ensure that the insurance will be there when we're using it. But it's being brave enough to just trial some of these new products within our schemes and take the risk almost with the products.
Okay. Rob, give us a big picture view. So one of the slides that we saw at the start talked about the sort of high level of commitment, the lower level of progress. I think it was taken from an EY piece of research. So just give us a sense of what you're seeing in terms of the UK private sector at the moment and how rapidly progress is being made.
Sure. Well, hi, everyone. Rob Dopel. I'm the managing partner for sustainability at EY. I always know you're going to learn something when you come to these panels, but I didn't realise I was going to learn I could get a nose filter for my nose. I mean, we have a nose the size of mine. That's really interesting. But no, you're right, James. One of the things I think when you sit on these panels with companies that this, you do end up hanging out with companies who are on it, who are leading on this and who are taking it super seriously. That said, and I look at the FTSE 100, we did the research, you would have seen the slides flipping through. Even with those companies that are fully engaged in this, there's still a lot of work to do on transition planning. The transition plan task force has come out with some really strong guidance. We're not there yet, but we are making progress. The thing I think sometimes we miss is, and we're having this conversation around the supply chain and the second tier, third tier, when you get down to that level, who haven't got all the resources of a FTSE 100, and you say, how are you going to decarbonise your business? First thing they say, well, the only way I can decarbonise my part of the supply chain, my business, is I have to stay in business first. Yeah. And there are a lot of pressures on these organisations whose products mix are changing, and we're putting more pressure on them to say we want less of that product, we want more of the new product. And that transition of slowing down on product A and ramping up product B, it's really hard. I mean, and these are organisations, as I say, haven't got the resources of likes we've got on this panel and my organisation, big companies, and that's one of the things where we need to get much more focus and much more support deeper into supply chains to help smaller companies, medium companies through that transition, and also supply chains that are not within the UK and not within UK government reach.
In terms of sectors, who's lagging, would you say, Rob? And why is that happening?
Who's lagging?
I mean, the people who obviously have the biggest challenges are the hard-to-abate sectors.
Yeah.
But is there kind of greater complexity in that picture than simply the case that sort of steel is the furthest behind, or you know, cement manufacturers are the furthest behind?
Yeah, I think it's hard not to argue that the big, you know, that's why they're hard to abate, right? Because they're hard to decarbonise, and therefore they're lagging where we'd like them to be. If I flip it a little bit and say, where's the positives? I think what we're seeing in financial services over the last 3 years is incredibly positive, because that, when the money moves, we can move industry with it. So if you're looking for, and I'm always looking for green shoots, I'm always trying to look for the positives. That's a massive positive, I think, what's happening in financial services, and the UK leading on that, which will create more finance and create you know, more opportunities for those hard to decarbonise sectors. But yeah, there are some nice stories when you look into things like textiles and consumer products, but the heavy lifting is still in those. You know, it's cement, steel, it's glass, it's chemicals, and of course energy. And we've still got a huge way to go on energy and the decarbonisation of the energy system. Okay, and just before I kind of open this up to the room, can I ask you where you think we are kind of in government terms? So we're obviously sort of heading towards a potential Labour government next year. We're at a point with the current government where there is perhaps, you know, it's fair to say, a sense of running out of steam on many of these issues. What do you think is the trajectory over the next year? Because obviously the policy environment is really important, and having a stable policy environment is really important for everyone who's here. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, might say we had some good government policy, I think, a couple of years ago. So the 10-point plan for green revolution is I think one of the best bits of policy. It's a very simple document, but it really did lay the tram lines for how we're going to decarbonise heavy industry in the UK. And I think the Chris Skidmore review was super important as well, because I think Chris did a very good job at getting cross-party engagement and cross-party support in that. I do get slightly concerned when, you know, and you sort of understand why they do it, but the Labour policy came out, and it's, you know, I'm all for wind, and people in the room here are deep into, you know, the actual power transition. But we can't just keep sort of wishing that we'll do more and more gigawatt of offshore or onshore. There are challenges to that. I think sometimes less of the bravado of let's go from 30 gigawatt to 40 gigawatt to 50 gigawatt. But let's actually go to the supply chain and say, how are we going to ensure we hit 30 by 2030? How are we going to hit 40 before we keep adding sort of ambitious targets without the support in the value chain and the supply chain? Yeah, I don't know if there's anyone here from the wind sector. I think wind is a really interesting example of a sector that seems to be stagnating, and it's interesting, maybe a topic for another day to kind of to look at why. But let's open this up to the room a little bit. I think a lot of you will have been having conversations that are very similar to the ones that Jenny and Sarah are having. So I know it's very, very early in the morning. Your second coffees have probably only just kicked in, but I'd love to hear from you. Yes.
Marion Verle, I'm CEO and co-founder of SustainCert, a climate impact verifier. So we've launched the first digital verification platform for carbon offsets and corporate scope 3 interventions. So the question I have for the panel, I'd love to hear your thoughts on a lot of the conversation around decarbonization and scope 3 really focuses on the areas where it makes business sense. So that was one of your examples. Obviously, we know that to reach net zero, we need to decarbonize in areas where it doesn't make business sense. It's going to be more costly to decarbonize in those areas. So are you having those conversations internally, and how are they going? And maybe, Rob, from your perspective, what is needed to make those decarbonization decisions make business sense and therefore accelerate decarbonization?
Thanks. Could you just say your name again?
Marion Verle from SustainCert.
Marion Verle. Okay.
Marion, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Should we just take a few more points? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Martin Kerr, Global Director of Impact at Forum for the Future. My first point is around 2050.
There's a mic behind you, Martin.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. So Martin Kerr, Global Director of Impact at Forum for the Future. The first point is around the 2050 here. Obviously, this is the UK target, but actually the latest IPCC synthesis report actually highlights that the UK and other high-emission countries actually have to aim for 2040.
Yeah.
So are we ambitious enough? That would be the first question. But the second one is more around the issue around net zero itself as a concept, because it assumes in a way that we can do a lot of bad things. As long as we do a lot of good things, we can kind of balance it out. And it's great to hear the great things you're doing in built environment and in health and advising companies around this. But don't we need a systemic approach as well, where we look at the deep and urgent transitions? You mentioned in your introduction, Jivan, that there is food, for example. 1/3 of all global emissions are from the food system, and we haven't even talked about food yet. So don't we need a systemic approach to really tackle this?
Yeah, okay. I suspect that last question is one for a politician who isn't present on this panel, but let's try some of the other ones. Jenny, do you want to take the first point about the conversation about areas where it doesn't make business sense? Great question.
Yeah, really great question, and it's actually ones we're grappling with. So for our operational emissions, we've got a transition plan to meet our near-term target. And last year, we went to our executive team to ask for £135 million to decarbonise our existing standing assets. So quite a lot of money over the next 7 years that we need to fund. We didn't have to put in a business case for that 135 million. Why? Because we knew that by doing this, by taking out gas-fired boilers, replacing them with air source heat pumps, doing the customer engagement, we knew that we would develop, or ensuring that our assets would be there for the long term, ensuring that we retained occupiers, retained the rent, increased or retained the value of the assets. So actually the business case is not about what is the return on investment for that 135 million. If we don't do this, we will have obsolete buildings within our portfolio. So we will soon have stranded assets. So that's really the reason why we decarbonise. I think from a embodied carbon point, really live issues that we're having, it is a challenge. So our target is to reduce embodied carbon by 50% from a typical building. A typical building embodied carbon is about 1,000 kgs per square metre. We need to get to 500 kgs per square metre by 2030 if we're to meet our targets. And that's really challenging. And carbon tends to, or low carbon materials, low carbon processes, even though you're designing buildings with less materials, it tends to have a higher development costs. So those conversations are live at the moment. How can we achieve those embodied carbon without ensuring that we're not creating an unviable or commercially viable product? So really live conversations at the moment.
Thanks, Jenny. Rob, did you want to pick up on?
Yeah, pick up as well. I think for me, there's two things. So one of the areas where we know organisations haven't spent enough time on is that financial planning. So when we did our analysis on the transition plans, and there's loads of great transition plans with some really great commitments in them, what's lacking, and this was sort of basically the raging red indicator when we did our research, was there's not enough financial planning or sensitivity analysis on that financial planning. So therefore, I don't think we yet understand both the costs but also the benefits and the opportunities for it. That's one. Second point I'd say is one of the challenges as well is these business cases are long-term. And for some industries, and Jen's got a great industry which does think long-term, but some industries don't really, they're not planning any more than 3 or 5 years. An energy industry will plan out 50 years. Hinkley Point's a 100-year business case. I'm glad I wasn't working on that one. So therefore, you're asking management teams to make decisions on things that are beyond their actual realm, and that's just hard and creates a little bit of time. And then the third point I'd say is that's also the point where we need strong policy, because if it is going to cost more, then it's the I'll move when you move dilemma, because if I go first, right, then my product's going to be more expensive, I go out of business. So I'm waiting. And that's where you need government policy in to push everyone up at the same time. And that's everything, everywhere, all at once, because as it said on food, it's required everywhere. And we just had two examples here of 2 different companies, and you get into the weeds of it, and it's so detailed, and it's so, you need people who really understand the value chain and understand the dilemma you're trying to fix, and then set policy, and then somehow get that policy replicated globally so we can get the value chain up globally. That's why we have these big jamborees every year called COP. But unfortunately, they don't always get down to the level that we need them as yet.
Sarah. Build with that. So I think it's a great question. We could probably talk on that all morning, but because there are some areas where it depends on how you set the frame of the business case. So just in the last 2 weeks, I've been having a lot of conversations about our goals around virgin plastic reduction. And the challenge we have is at the moment, the alternatives which can be getting into something completely different, like pulp-based packaging, or moving from virgin plastic to chemically recycled or bioplastic, in our case, because we're a healthcare company. So there's big limitations on our ability to use mechanically recycled content that's lower cost because we're in contact with a medicine. So from a regulatory point of view, that's mostly not possible for us. In some applications it is, but mostly not.
Does that mean you generally have to use virgin material, or is there another option?
Well, chemically recycled or bioplastic are our alternatives, or getting into new technologies like pulp-based packaging. But the challenge is they all come at a very significant premium to virgin plastic. And I would say there's kind of three different things that can help with the business case. One is consumer pull. So it's very clear that consumers want to buy products using recycled content. Also customers. So our big retail customers, whether that's Amazon, Walmart, A.S. Watson, whomever, have all got big ambitions of their own and also want to make it easy for their shoppers to buy sustainably. And they're creating a really interesting incentive with sustainable choices ranges like, Amazon Climate Pledge products or Walmart Built for Better. And one of the ways you can qualify into those is by using recycled content. So you can get a kind of payback that way. And then the final one is policy with things like EPR tax. The challenge at the moment, though, is EPR, and this might seem like a crazy thing to say, is set at a level where it's nothing like the level of the premium. So there's maybe something different that could be done there that would make the business case more equitable. But I think looking at the different, like you were saying, Jenny, the different lenses for the business case, in our case, customers, i.e. retailers, and policy can help, make that business case more favourable, if you like. But then, you have to try and sell that multi-dimensional business case internally.
I think we're heading quite neatly into an attempt to answer Martin's final point, which is about systems change, which I'd like to sort of talk to you a bit more about, Sarah. So how do you, I think kind of one of the sort of interesting things that Martin raises when we talk about food, I think there's a bit of a disconnect between where politicians are on food and where the public is on food. I think the public is in quite a different place, and you touched on that in your previous answer. I think there's a strong public desire for sustainable products. I think there are maybe sort of two kind of problems. One of them is that customers don't quite know what to choose or how, and are unsure, whether products are genuinely green or just greenwashing. And the other is that I think that in a cost of living crisis as we're in at the moment, often like some of those concerns are pushed to the side, and they say, well, this is the choice that I have to make. So how do you begin to have that conversation and begin to earn customers' trust, really, that your products are green and can be sustainable?
Yeah, I think consumers probably quite rightly want it all. They want products that are at a competitive price, that deliver great benefits and efficacy, and are more sustainable. So you often read that people are prepared to pay more. I would be a little bit careful about that, particularly in the current context. I think in terms of earning trust, it's really important to be transparent and very objective in the way that you put forward the credentials of your products, and if you're going to make a claim, back it up with what's behind that. And I actually think the retailer ranges are a really good way of doing it, because there's one set of rules for how products qualify for those ranges, and they apply to everyone. So if you're a consumer shopping on Amazon or in Walmart and something's got the Built for Better badge, you can go on and see what's it had to do to qualify. And I think that's actually very helpful from a consumer's point of view, rather than us all individually making up our own rules for what qualifies for a specific claim. And I think that can help build trust. I think there's lots of apps and things that people are using, probably too many at the moment. There'll maybe be a few horses that kind of win the race in helping, again, consumers objectively score different products based on what's important to them. But I think those kind of referee platforms, whether it's a retailer's criteria or an app's criteria, are actually really helpful in providing a unified framework that everyone understands what's that product had to do to meet that hurdle.
Yeah. Sarah, just go back, Sarah, up at some stats.
Yeah.
Because we did a future consumer index in May, so this is quite new data as well. And the three blockers were exactly that: high price, 60, almost 70% saying higher price, I think maybe because of current climate as well. Secondly was on misleading information, which was 56%, and then the third one was a perception of lower quality. So they're all things I think we have to overcome to break the perception, and I think some of them are perception rather than fact.
Just explain what you meant by that, Rob. Those are things that deter customers from making
Sorry,
green
they're the things that, yeah, exactly, deterring customers from making more sustainable choices.
Okay, thank you. There was a hand raised at the front. Yeah.
Just back to some of the...
Just tell us your name.
It's Alex Watson.
Hey, Alex.
So I work for a non-profit called Clean Trade. Did some research into...
Yeah, there's a mic heading your way. Yeah.
Thanks. So Alex Watson from Clean Trade did some research into the possible impact of a carbon border tax. So, adjusting the price of goods at the border to decarbonise. So, I guess the debate's very interesting about encouraging consumers to, or the government regulations that can encourage consumers versus something like a carbon border price, which I guess just goes back to the fundamental input materials. I just wondered, Jenny, on your live discussion about the regulatory framework, do you see something like the product standards of the building being more a kind of way forward, or a kind of carbon border, carbon pricing approach on the kind of input materials? And I guess, there are clearly it would raise prices. Both of those probably would raise prices for someone like a Lend-Lease, but hopefully, there are many companies that have their decarbonised plans in place such that they think they could kind of win in their market. So I just wondered what you make of those two options.
Thank you, Mark. I suspect your answer is going to be both.
Yeah, it's both, but also it's actually a good question because something we've sort of trialled as an internal shadow price of carbon to try and be on the front foot if taxes like a border tax were coming into place within the construction materials. So we put £80 per tonne of carbon as our shadow price of carbon on. So that is a cost we add to the total development costs when we're looking at what it costs. What we've found with that, and in some developers, they use that shadow price of carbon as a tax on the development teams that is then used to fund energy efficiency projects across standing assets. What we've decided to do is that actually didn't seem to... It raised an awareness of embodied carbon within the development. However, it didn't really drive behaviour changes enough. So I think...
Why didn't it?
Because it wasn't a big enough amount. The £80 per tonne is not a big enough amount. That's a small, that's a small amount to the total. So, so what we are finding that is driving more change is, as I described before, is bringing carbon consultants right in at the start of designs. It's engaging early with that supply chain, and it's thinking differently about how we design buildings and how we construct them and how we can use modern methods of construction, look at other industries to design and develop our schemes. So we need to do more around the embodied carbon, but I don't think tax is a big enough, or a tax, yes, it will drive change, but I don't think it's a big enough incentive to drive the change that we need. I think we need to be engaging with consumers to understand, what does it mean to occupy a net zero building? What does a net zero building for you, what does it mean for you as an occupier? You can't be phoning up help desk every 5 minutes saying, I'm too hot, too cold, so that we have to put on heating and cooling.
I feel seen.
There you go. Don't phone help desk. But we need, and consumers from a built environment, just as consumers are sort of pushing for more sustainable products in the healthcare industry, you as consumers need to push developers and landlords for net zero in construction and operations. So that's about ensuring that asking on the space you're moving into, what are the embodied carbon? What is the energy use intensity of this building? What is the proportion of renewables that this building is operating on? So we need that consumer demand. I hope that answered your question.
Jenny, just give us a sense of what some of those behaviour changes look like. I mean, one of them is not fiddling with the aircon all the time, but there are also kind of like fundamental changes in how offices are set up, right? And how we work in them. So what are some of those changes that are needed?
So we've actually been doing, so within our scope 3, we've got 90% of our scope, 90% of our carbon footprint is from our Scope 3 emissions. 40% of that 90% is from the energy consumed in our occupied spaces. So we've been engaging with our highest, and this is within office, we've been engaging with some of our highest energy consuming office occupiers to go and do exactly that, do deep dives of their space, understand how they use energy, and then come up with recommendations that they can take, not landlord stuff, because we're doing the landlord stuff with our decarbonisation, but what they can take to change the way they occupy their space. And it's simple things. The recommendation, I mean, it's not rocket science. It's like turning off your perimeter lights that often are on within buildings. They're not actually on at the moment. Turning off perimeter lights. Comms rooms are often the set temperature point in comms rooms are set at about 15 degrees. We've moved all servers out of comms rooms. Often there's not servers in those comms. Turn the temperature down. Small power equipment, all of your monitors and your phones and your PCs. Put smart bars in which can turn these small electrical equipment off centrally. So there's simple things. I think the changing thing is the hybrid working.
Yeah, that must be quite tricky to sort of to figure out how hybrid working intersects exactly with net zero, right? Because not everyone, I mean, people are not coming into the offices, but they're coming in kind of 3 days a week, or 30% of a team is coming in on certain days. So it's quite a complicated thing. Must be quite a complicated thing to manage.
Well, what we're trialling at our head office in Victoria is this zonal working practices. So we know Friday is our quietest day. We're making everyone that comes in on a Friday sit in a certain area of the office so that we don't have to turn on the heating and cooling and lighting on, again, heating and cooling in the other area of the business, the floor plate. Really simple thing, but we can all do that as occupiers in spaces where we know we've got low occupancy days, zone the areas so that you're reducing your energy demand. I think the next step for us as a landlord is bringing occupiers within our workspaces together and saying, right, we've seen that on Mondays and Fridays only 3 of our floors are occupied. How can we potentially say to occupiers, would you come in on a Monday and Friday and share a space with the tenants? That might be more difficult to achieve, but I think that's where we need to be moving with hybrid working being far more prolific.
Yeah, I mean, Rob, this is an example of a kind of tricky kind of conversation for a business to have, right? A sort of asking its customers to sort of change how they operate. Are you hearing this kind of story from other sectors?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great example of some of the small things. I mean, sometimes we focus on the big things that organisations have to do, but actually a lot of it's the amalgamation of really small changes as well. And I think there is something around how do you get people excited about the small changes? Yeah.
Making energy management sexy.
yeah, that's right. And it's not super easy, you know, and it's all about sort of carbon consultants. Typically, you get advisors come in when there's a big chunky issue, when it's something big, whereas a lot of the plans we need do cover the big things, so the big assets or the equipment changes, the power changes, etc. But actually, there's also a whole bunch of small things. It's individual, so it's like nudge behaviour theory, isn't it? So the small things that we do as employees, and how that change the way we interact with our employer, and then also I suppose and then how do you get your customers to behave in a slightly different way as well?
I think of it a bit like kind of cleaning up a beach. I mean, it might not be that everybody cleaning up a beach is making a dramatic contribution to getting plastic out of the ocean, but it helps people feel involved and helps people feel active in the face of a gigantic problem. Rob, just staying with you for a moment, what do you think are the sort of major obstacles really to making progress? So we've talked about some of the issues and how we unwind some of the issues, but what do you see as really the biggest obstacles at the moment?
So if I stick on the corporate world, right? So I suppose if I look at sort of real economy corporates, I do think we are still not in a maturity of planning. I'll come back to my transition plans soapbox, right? You've got to plan effectively. To get anything done in a big corporate, we all know it's hard. In small corporates, it's hard, but you've got to have a really robust plan. Yeah. And we are not yet at that level where we've got long-term robust plans. And when you do those long-term robust plans, what you find is there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can do, and there's a whole bunch of things that you realise we can't do this on our own. And then, therefore, we're going to have to collaborate. And your list of things that go into collaboration bucket gets bigger. The list, your requirements of policy and government become clearer, so you can then become more active in putting your point of view forward. But the collaboration point, I think, is where and this is the exciting thing, you talk about being a journalist in this age, the exciting thing I get as an advisor is I think we are moving rapidly into this period of mass collaboration, where we will get much more cooperation. Hopefully, you're both nodding, so that's good. But much more cooperation between competitors who have been used to, doing everything to beat each other and outwit each other, to actually realise there's a bunch of things on our plan that we can't do on our own. We have to collaborate. And if we think that government's going to fix it, then we're having a laugh. We have to, and this is where I think we are looking for FTSE 100, we're looking for the big organisations to lead. So we're going to have to collaborate and bring our supply chain together, bring us as competitors together to say, in the void of policy, what commitments are we going to make collectively, which will then give signals to our supply chain so they can make the changes they need to, or what signals we're going to give to our customers and say, we're just not going to give you that anymore. It's going to cost more. The price is going to go up. If we do it all together, then there's a chance we might actually get faster progress. And this is happening, but I think we're moving into a period of mass collaboration.
You used the phrase long term, but just sort of coming back to, I think Martin made the point that 2050, is some way off, but we perhaps don't have that much time. So do you think that businesses really need to think about this in a shorter time frame, actually looking towards the end of this decade, 2030, 2040, rather than sort of further off in the distance?
Yes, but not at the berest of doing the long-term planning as well. So I think you need both. But as I said, I think the experience has been when you're with clients who are going deep into that financial planning. I'll come back to this, the financial planning as well, and the sensitivity analysis. That does drive we're probably going to have to start this earlier than we thought because of the lead time of implication. But I think I'm also, as I said, I'm positive. I also think when we get moving as a civilization, we can move incredibly quickly on things. So I do think we have to plan out to 2050. If we're still, I think we have an opportunity to get there before 2050. But I'd like us not to try and do it all in 10 years or by 2030, because that's just not realistic for many industries.
I heard a great, and I want to steal it, I heard a great analogy about what we need to do with the climate crisis to act quicker the other day. And it was like, look how we responded to the COVID pandemic, and we came up with a solution to the COVID pandemic. I've forgotten the word.
Vaccine?
Vaccine, that's the word. A vaccine in such a short space of time.
I'm glad that all of COVID has gone down the memory hole. Do you remember those things
that we all got told to shove in our arms? We came up with a vaccine really quickly. We need to treat the climate crisis like we treated the pandemic, and really have fires in our belly. All of us have fires in our belly to take action, and take action now, and not be paralysed by saying, oh, the regulation is there, the customers don't want to. We just need to act, and act now. And I think if we treat the climate crisis like we did the pandemic, we will deliver the action that's required.
I think it's a really interesting parallel, isn't it?
It's massive, because I think the same thing around, I think we've got Steve here from National Grid, about grid connections, and we talk about planning. Now, I've been in this country 20 years, and we've been talking about improving the planning and permitting process for 20 years.
Yeah.
And what is that about? That's just about inconvenience for us as humans, right? And I don't want that there, or that's going to make I'm going to have to drive longer, etc. And we listened to it. But on COVID, like when it really mattered, right, we all stayed inside. I mean, I still think of it. It's insane. You didn't walk out the house. You left someone. You moved around them on the footpath. Crazy stuff, right? Yeah. But we did it because it was really important, because we were all scared that something bad was going to happen. So something bad's going to happen. Something bad is happening, but we're still not taking it seriously. And I think that's a responsibility for all of us. Yeah. I think around we're still not as a community accepting the reality. We're going to have to make more connections into wind. We are going to have to. We're going to have to be a little bit more forgiving for inconvenience if we want to make this transition happen at pace.
Yeah, maybe two thoughts on that is make it everyone's job. Yeah. So I think what happened in COVID was, everyone was at risk, and everyone thought, shit, I've got to do something about it. And I think we kind of need the same with carbon. So rather than it being the job of the sustainability team or the job of the procurement or whomever, it needs to be everybody's job. And we're a new company, we're at the beginning of that, but what I'm trying to do in my role is make it part of everyone's job and make it relevant to their job. and say, you know, if you're looking after the oral health category, did you realise that air pollution is affecting tooth enamel and you're in the business of that and your emissions are this big and here's your share of the target that we've got. So trying to bring it down into everybody's job so that everyone sees why it matters for your business, because you're trying to help protect people's tooth enamel and solve tooth sensitivity, and this is getting in the way of that, and what's your share of the target? And then give people tools to help them do it. So I mean, lots of companies have got impact assessment tools, but you know, putting that power in the hands of the person that's reinventing the next toothpaste, so they know if I choose that, it's going to make the footprint worse. If I choose that, it's going to make it better. And similarly with our procurement teams, when they're choosing between suppliers, we've given them like a carbon clock. So it's like, okay, well, you know, the power's in your hands, make the right decision. So I think trying to make it.
Is that something you've done already, Sarah? So,
we're doing it now, yeah. So.
And do you have the data that you need to make that kind of switch? I mean, that presumably is quite hard to get accurate data all across your supply chain to know exactly how to make that choice, right?
Yeah, I think you just got to start with like good enough is good enough, you know. Yeah. So the data will keep getting better, but I wouldn't wait for the perfect data, because you know we'll all be on the quest for the holy grail of perfect data for a very long time. But you know, equipping people with ready reckoners that help them get visibility of the impact of decisions now with the best data you've got, I think is good. Just get going, keep making it better. And then on the so I think make it everyone's job. And then we're all in it together would be my other thing. I think that was one of the spirits of COVID that really got people to realise their collective responsibility differently, and can we hang on to a bit of that mindset. So what you were saying, Rob, about kind of radical collaboration. Don't see, you know, we're working with Reckitt and J&J, who are normally our kind of like arch rivals, but we need to, because we need to be going to our suppliers and asking for the same things. Because it's only then that they'll have the critical mass of demand to make it worth their while. So
exactly. Very unusual conversations here to have. Let's have a couple more. There's a couple more hands raised in the room. First the lady there, and then the gentleman in the blue suit. If you just speak out, we don't have mics to you yet. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Thank you. So it's on the points of collaboration and cross-industry partnerships and collaborations.
Just tell us your name.
Sorry, Alicia from Rolls-Royce, Sustainability Manager.
Hi.
So we're often trying to work in partnership with our peers in the industry, but something we're coming up against is some very scared antitrust and competition lawyers in the room telling us, don't stop there, don't say anything. And it's really annoying, I guess. But I think it's very much driven by this scaremongering happening in the anti-ESG movement in the US, where obviously some anti-ESGers are using antitrust law in a shoddy way to stop the Glasgow Net Zero Banking Alliance. And even if it's a shoddy use of the law, it's working in terms of scaremongering companies and in you know that collaboration part. So my question is, have you got any kind of good examples of where, you know, successful collaborations, and particularly it's kind of easy where it's a collaboration where you know the price does keep low and it's an easy one. The hard parts and the ones where we actually need the collaboration is when it is costly and the price is going to go up for consumers, which is when the antitrust bit comes in. So yeah, wondering if you've got good examples of kind of how we avoid that.
Brilliant. Let's take a couple of points in the last few minutes we have. If you just pass the mic to your left, there's a lady in the green dress, then the gentleman in the blue shirt, and then finally the man in the blue suit. Yeah.
Hi, Lizzie Crotty from Australian Wildlife Conservancy.
Hi, Lizzie.
Just in the thinking along the lines of this long-term planning, and then also what Rob very aptly said about, you know, something bad is happening now, something very, very bad is about to come. Just thinking about the TNFD and whether that started to come into your planning as a business, and Rob, whether you've been seeing that in clients, particularly thinking in, you know, food production and things like that. I think the European Central Bank mentioned that 72% of Eurozone companies are at severe risk of biodiversity loss, and 3/4 of bank loans are going to be dependent, at risk as well of biodiversity loss. So just wondered if you had been thinking about that in your long-term planning as well.
Thank you. Can you pass the microphone, Lizzie? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Michael Watson from Vincent Mason's, Head of Climate and Sustainability, Vincent Mason's. I was really interested in this fantastic discussion The piece I was thinking about a lot was, what got us here won't get us there, and that comes out very strongly. But to thinking about that in the context of corporate decision making, how does one change one's decision making processes within the business to more effectively accelerate those decisions? Rob's very articulately explained that government policy won't get us there alone. There's a whole range of factors one needs to factor in. And one thing we're finding a lot is ourselves and with our clients is how does one engage on radical change in terms of corporate decision making around the governance structures. Be really interested if you've got any examples of that.
Thank you. And
Samuel Pachou, partner at EY. So Rob asked me to ask simple questions, so I will do my best.
ask a hard one.
so just a couple of things. First on the how, I think, using the analogy of COVID, we said it's everyone's problem. And we know corporations have a big part to play. So what should corporations do to make everyone's problem today, to actually solve it? We know talking about consumers. So that's the first part. And the second one...
Sorry, what should who do?
So what should corporations do to actually make everyone's problem, to actually solve that as quick as we can? Because we know, to Martin's point, that we have to accelerate to actually achieve net zero by 2050. And the second one is more on the first part, everything everywhere. So what's the role of the UK, if any, to actually influence at a global level? Because, we had the highest carbon emission last year ever. So it's not really going in the right direction. So while, in the UK we're making good progress, we're making good progress in energy and actually, across the value chain, but what's the role of the UK, if any, to actually make a difference at global level?
Okay, great, thanks. Great questions. Sarah, do you want to take the antitrust point?
Yeah, it's really difficult, the antitrust piece, and I completely agree with what you said, that it slows things down and you have a lot of nervous conversations and get advice from lawyers before you go into rooms. I think the thing that makes a big difference is having a neutral third party convening people. So whether that's an industry association or we're working on Scope 3 as part of Manufacture 2030, and we've created a subgroup within that where ourselves, Reckitt, J&J can come together. So having an independent broker helps. I think the challenge is configuring that in a small enough way that you can move fast enough, because we've probably all had experience of being in big industry associations where you're trying to move the agenda and inevitably it goes at the speed of the slowest company. So I think maybe one thing I found helps is being part of a big collaboration like Manufacture 2030, but setting up a subgroup within it where you just bring like a kind of sprint squad of a few players together so you can move a bit faster on something that's specific to you, but still under the protection of that independent convening third party, which I think at the moment is necessary under the current competition law environment that we have.
Yeah, and we've also had pretty clear signalling from the CMA on this, haven't we? So they've said you can have these conversations. Let's say, I think, asked for a tangible example. I don't know if there was one that sort of springs to mind immediately.
Yeah, so it would be that one within, so Manufacture 2030 is an industry-wide platform that is trying to create a one-stop shop so that suppliers can use that technology to map their carbon emissions. So instead of every company rocking up and asking them to do it differently, which drives suppliers nuts, not quite rightly, because then they have to do it 42 different times. They are creating a platform to allow you to do it once. Then within that platform, ourselves, Reckitt, J&J, P&G, Unilever, many FMCG companies are calling on their suppliers to get on that platform, map their emissions in one consistent way. And then what we've done is create a subgroup within it where it's healthcare companies, so us, Kenvue, as was J&J, Consumer Bit, Reckitt, others, to specifically focus on some of our high-impact materials like paracetamol, ibuprofen, etc., that are particularly important to us. They might not be big in the great scheme of things for Manufacture 2030, but let's get a small squad working together to make a collective ask of our suppliers. So making a small group within a big thing to try and get it to move faster.
Rob, we've talked about net zero for an hour without talking about biodiversity, as Lizzie pointed out.
Yeah.
Do you want to address that?
I was just thinking exactly the same thing. I mean, the answer to the question, yes. So I think in the last year, I think biodiversity has just raised up the agenda incredibly quickly. TNFD, which is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is coming in, will drive even more of that. I think the real challenge we have for biodiversity in nature is it's the measurement angle. And carbon, whilst we're having all these challenges with carbon, the one thing is it's sort of easier to measure because we can talk about CO2 emissions. Biodiversity is so diverse.
So many different indicators.
So many different measures. So when we've been trying to we've got some people working on that task force to try and create that framework, and that's been the real challenge of what you can't measure everything and make it too onerous on organisations. So you have to sort of pick it and try and hone it down. But that will definitely help. And I think what also is really clear is, and I think we're talking about a lot more, is that link between biodiversity and climate. So you can't talk about one without the other. And I think we've seen that at COP27. I think it'll be again at big COP28 this year.
Jenny, would you like to pick up Michael's point about decision making?
Yeah, I think it was around how do you change decision making within corporates. I think for us as a real estate company, as I said, like our executives are very much hearing about the climate crisis from investors, from regulation, and that's really driving our decarbonisation plans. But something that we've done, a practical example of something that we've done, which sort of ties into what Sarah said about making sure it's everybody's responsibility, is linking our energy intensity and carbon targets to a proportion of our remuneration. And that's really driven decision-making and really driven employee engagement significantly. We've been doing it for the last 2 years, and when we did that, the amount of requests into my team on what do we need to do in finance, procurement and development team to ensure that we get our bonus has really driven that decision-making. And that's quite... I was going to say that's quite sad because it's money, but it's alongside that understanding that investors are asking for it, occupiers are asking, and regulation demanding it. So it's just another lever that we're pulling on.
Thanks for the most practical point of the morning, Jenny. We'll remember that. I'll recommend that to my boss. Seren's question is a great question, a tricky one to answer. Rob, do you want to have a go at it? The UK's leadership on climate. Obviously, we've been cutting emissions, but emissions are a planetary problem, not just a problem for one country.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thanks, Sam. That's it easy. So I think my take on this is that people do still look at the UK, particularly with things like regulation and policy. And I think about what we've done, for example, with renewables over the last few decades, has been a blueprint. Some of the mechanisms that we put in place to incentivise investment in renewables have been copied and replicated in other parts of the world. So I do think, and this hurts a bit as an Aussie talking about the UK, I think the UK's got a big part to play, but I think people do watch what happens here because of the history, because of the strong legal framework, because of the strong regulatory framework. So I think it's that's the area I think the UK can lead. I think we have to sort of always get over ourselves as well, which is we're such a small part of the globe, so therefore what does it make a difference here? It's like, well, if you have that mentality, we might as well just give up, right? We can only control what we can control. And I think what we can do is show leadership for the rest of the world. Hopefully they'll watch and take something from it. I think that historically you've got some precedents that's happened.
And rich countries obviously have power to shape global supply chains, as we're going to see with the EU. So,
spot on.
Thank you all for your attention. Rob, Sarah and Jenny, I'd just like to close with perhaps just a final thought from each of you. We've got a collective of highly engaged, very focused people in this room. As Jenny said, there are a lot more people out there that we need to go out and talk to and have conversations with. So what's kind of one thing perhaps you'd like these people here to kind of go out and do following this conversation?
So my ask would be, and actually, Sarah, you actually picked up on this, is go back to your organisations and ask not the Chief Sustainability Officer what they're doing or what our plan is. Ask all your other leaders in the business what their plan is. Because I still think we're in a situation where a lot of organisations and employees are looking to Chief Sustainability Officers, sorry guys, but to sort of be the solver of all problems in an organisation. And I think we need more responsibility from supply chain directors, from CFOs, from HR directors, from all your leadership team need to be taking ownership of this problem and this challenge. And I think in some organisations that's the case, but not ever. So that would be my ask. Go back and ask your other leaders in the organisation what they're doing and what role they're playing.
Thanks, Rob.
I'm going to build off that and say in terms of what we can do is make it easy for those people right across the business to take action by breaking it down into what's your share of the footprint, what are the levers you can pull, and equip people with the knowledge and understanding and the tools to take action. Because, you know, I think we all know if we sit in central sustainability functions, we can set the direction, but we can't make the action happen. We need to put the power in people in frontline positions' hands to make it part of their day job. So I think our job is to make it, in the same way we're trying to make it easy for consumers and shoppers to choose the right thing, make it easy for your colleagues to do the right thing and take the action by giving them visibility of what they can do to bring your carbon footprint down and equip them with the tools they need to do it.
Thank you. And Jenny, some world-changing advice in a minute.
I'm just going to bring it back to sort of the real estate world, and hopefully all of us are occupying some form of workspace or office space. So my recommendation would be speak to your landlord. We need to really change the landlord-tenant relationship to be one of collaboration. So speak to your landlord, find out what they're doing to decarbonise your workspace, and find out how you can do simple things to your workspace to ensure that you're also decarbonising.
Brilliant. Thank you all very much for your attention and terrific questions. Thanks very much to our panel, Rob, Sarah and Jenny. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.